Well, good afternoon, everybody. First declaration, I am a walker, so I'm going to be walking around like this. If I fall off the stage, can somebody please come and give me immediate first aid? The subject I'm going to be tackling today, I've got a great piece of timing because I get to riff off the papers we've already heard this morning and off Elizabeth's paper that we've just heard. And in a way, I'll be lurking at slip, ready for some fine spin bowling to take an easy catch. Hopefully we'll see some of that from England in the Ashes next month. That's my obligatory cricket reference out of the way. Now, on the subject of sticky wickets, to return to the subject of cricket, on the subject of sticky wickets, the British Army has, on occasion, in its long and glorious history, found itself batting on an extremely sticky wicket. There was no stickier wicket than the Western Front of 1915. Indeed, the entire year 1915 probably ranks as one of the worst in the long history of the British Army. By the end of the year, the British Army had been defeated on all fronts. Its offences on the Western Front had failed, its offensive at Gallipoli had failed, its offensive in Mesopotamia had failed and been reversed, with the Ottomans now laying siege to Kut, and even the periphery operations in East Africa had ground to a halt. Indeed, when James Edmonds came to write the official history of the Western Front in 1915, he warned his readers in the introduction, this will make for very sad reading, and he was absolutely right. But Edmonds also mentioned that in remembrance of the final victory, we were apt, and this was he was of course referring to the British public and indeed the army of the 1920s, we were apt to forget the painful and weary early stages which ultimately led to that victory. And I think we see that reflected in the modern historiography of the British Army, particularly on the Western Front. The revisionist movement, which of course gained a lot of traction in Britain and elsewhere in the 1980s through the 90s to the present day, has tended to focus on the British Army from the Battle of the Somme onwards. Indeed, there's been two recent books by some of my colleagues at Wolverhampton, both of which refer to From the Somme to Victory. In that sense, you're effectively omitting almost 2 full years of war on the Western Front as if they simply didn't happen. And I think that's a great omission. And I think part of the reason why, particularly 1915, is omitted is because it is such an unremittingly difficult year for the British Army. And of course, when I refer to the British Army, I'm referring to the British Imperial Army as well. I'm not neglecting either the Indians, the Australians, the Canadians, or indeed the Newfoundlanders or the South Africans. But to return to the theme of Edmund, by the sheer difficulty of 1915 makes it worthy of study. It was indeed a year in which the Central Powers were ascendant, and this Austro-Hungarian cartoon, published in the summer of 1915, I think conveys this absolutely brilliantly. If you look in the bottom, you can see a representation of Ottoman Turkey feasting on British and French ships. On the Eastern Front, the combined German and Austrian armies are brutalizing the Russian giant and forcing him backwards, humiliating him in the process. If we look at John Bull sat astride the British Isles, he's fishing uselessly for elusive U-boats, while meanwhile in France you can see a badly injured France being supported by an anachronistic British redcoat. You notice the crutch, and they're supporting one another, whilst the Germans stand defiant in French territory. And particularly notice the abandoned rocking horse, or the riding horse, that's fallen into the Mediterranean Ocean, a reference to the illusion of an early war being shattered. And actually a particular favourite part of this, and the reason you can definitely tell it's an Austro-Hungarian cartoon, is the treatment of Italy, a ridiculous character who's been given a thorough smack in the teeth by an Austro-Hungarian soldier with his rifle butt. Leaving aside the amusement of this illustration, it does convey the situation that the Allies found themselves in 1915. Nowhere seemed to offer any opportunity for effective offensive action, and indeed, as Elizabeth has already mentioned, the brutal treatment of the Russian armies in late 14 and early 15 was a tremendous cause for concern for the British and the French, and prompted them to renew their efforts to try and breach the Western Front without, as we know, success. But the failure of the British armies on the Western Front in 1915 is no reason for it to be ignored. And I'm reminded of Professor Mansour's comment earlier this morning about the Americans ignoring Vietnam because it did not necessarily make for pleasant reading. I think there's a tendency, perhaps unintentional, perhaps some unintentional bias for British historians to ignore 1915 precisely because it's so difficult to read and so difficult to write about. There is no glory to be had here, and there's often a lot of very sad reading. But it actually neglects the extent to which the British Army adapted in 1915. Many of the adaptations made in 1915 laid a groundwork that would be expanded upon in 1916. Some went no further than the year in which they were devised, but others would form a framework that the Army would work with in the coming years. And I think that studying the British Army in 1915 has relevance today, particularly in an era of small professional armies who are often forced to fight alongside allies and often talk a great deal about learning and adaptation, but do we put enough emphasis on how that learning and adaptation is, in one sense, formalised during war, and also how do you replace the loss of experienced soldiers and leaders in the midst of a war? And some of the problems I'm going to show you that afflicted the British Army in 1915 you may well see relevance to today. First of all, I'd like to dispel a myth about the British Army in 1915, and that was that it was completely and utterly bewildered by trench warfare. One can occasionally come across reference to this, that trench warfare left the generals completely baffled, they didn't know what was happening, and so on. There was an element of this. John French admitted it at the end of 1914. Other junior officers commented upon it. Walter Congreve, VC, an officer I'll introduce to you in greater detail later in this talk, commented in December 14 rather bitterly that he felt completely uninitiated in this style of trench warfare. And that distinction is important. The British Army had fought against trenches in the Boer War, as we heard this morning. It had studied trench warfare in the Russo-Japanese War in considerable detail, a great deal of intellectual energy being expended on studying this war. It had even considered, though, to a lesser degree, the effect of entrenchment in the Balkan Wars. The particular tactical lessons it drew from these conflicts varied and were open to contradiction. They seemed to often provide confirmation bias rather than truly new lessons. But one lesson that seemed absolutely universal was that trenches alone did not win wars. They posed an obstacle, certainly. They posed a tactical difficulty to overcome. But the lessons of both the Boer War and the Russo-Japanese War seemed to be that a determined assault would breach these trenches and ultimately the offensive would win the war. This had been the case in the Boer War, and it had been the case in the Russo-Japanese War. And that was the view that the British Army had, trenches as a problem that could be overcome. And it believed it could overcome it using its pre-war assault tactics. Pre-war assault tactics that were known by the useful shorthand of fire and movement. And these had been developed during the Boer War, had been expanded. To an extent, they had been codified after the Boer War, though the extent to which they were can be discussed in some detail. But that shorthand of fire and movement and the idea that the two should never be disassociated in war was very, very clear in the British Army prior to the First World War. And this was not just infantry fire. It was expected that the fire of machine guns and the fire of artillery would support the movement of the infantry, would allow them to close and would allow them to carry out an assault. In some ways, this was an expansion of the assault tactics the British Army had been using during the latter stages of the conventional part of the Boer War, but now developed, expanded, and with greater belief that it would actually be successful. The artillery would play a key role in this. The artillery credo that the greater the difficulties of the infantry, the greater should be the support of the artillery, recognised that incoming fire from defensive positions could well stop infantry movement, at which point it would be necessary for the artillery to redouble its fire or find superior positions to suppress the enemy. But the concept of fire and movement was well enshrined, and it was not simply a rigid tactical prescription. It was understood that it would be adapted to the ground, to the situation, the time of day, the strength of the opposition. What was important was that there should be no movement without fire, and that fire should always be used wherever possible to facilitate movement. It would not really be enough to shoot the enemy out of their trenches. And so when the British Army began to encounter trenches, first at the Battle of the Aisne in September 1914, and then later during the Battle of First Ypres in October and November 1914, it was not entirely surprised to encounter them, and indeed the assault tactics employed against entrenched German positions were much the same as had been anticipated before the war. What puzzled the British Army at the end of 1914 was the existence of the Western Front. Not merely trench warfare, but now a front which ran from the English Channel right down to the Swiss border, over 400 miles in length, without any obvious weak spots and with no flanks to turn. And it was not, therefore, it was not trench warfare per se that troubled the British, it was its unique scale in the First World War. And it was also the appearance of a piece of low technology which completely altered the usage of fire and movement. That piece of low technology was, of course, barbed wire. Infantry cannot cross barbed wire in 1914 or 15 under its own power. Yes, there are wire cutters. Yes, there are devices which can allow one to cross barbed wire, what are known as barbed wire mats, or you can place over barbed wire and clamber over it. Bangalore torpedoes begin to appear in 1915. But all of these methods are uncertain and they cannot be used to breach wire under fire. The presence of barbed wire severely damages the British Army's tactical ability to carry out fire and movement tactics. If that barbed wire survives, the infantry cannot advance. And becoming trapped on the wire, or held up in front of the wire, is a fate that's feared by all infantrymen. In a no man's land that's devoid of cover, this obstacle can completely hamper your movement. You can no longer provide supporting fire for your colleagues on your flanks, and you'll be exposed to incoming German fire for which you have very little ability to respond to. This is a serious challenge to British tactical methods. Not to mention, of course, that the barbed wire is not merely an obstacle in itself. It's a military truism that an obstacle that is not defended by fire is just an engineering problem. But of course the Germans do defend their barbed wire belts with fire, both from rifles, machine guns, mortars, and of course artillery positioned further behind the lines. Therefore, fire and movement now faces an extremely difficult set of circumstances. You must cross an area of no man's land that is devoid of cover, you must overcome a military obstacle, and you must do all this whilst under heavy fire from defenders in prepared positions. Assuming you can do all this, assuming the barbed wire is breached, assuming you cross the ground, you then enter an enemy trench network which is bewildering, difficult to navigate, and will be defended at close range by German troops. Should you capture this German trench network, it is then likely you will face a German counterattack which will pour down communication trenches over ground which they know better than you do, and then pile into your bloodied assault troops. And this is the essence of the assault difficulty the British Army faces. The British Army is puzzled then by these problems, but it is not downhearted. What it does is it replaces fire and movement with fire then movement. The artillery will prepare the way, and the term that is used in late 1914, early 15 is bombard and storm, a type of fortress warfare method that's well known to the British Army. Effectively batter down the German defences in as short a space of time as possible, create a breach in the German line, which British infantry will then rupture, will pass through, will capture the ground, and hopefully will actually go beyond and will turn a tactical victory, a tactical break-in, into an operational breakout. This method is created very, very quickly by the British Army, and I think it's testament to the understanding of modern assault tactics that the British Army has before 1914, that it very quickly grasps that this is a method for using on the Western Front. The Royal Artillery in early 1915 actually constructs a series of replica German trenches based on aerial photography and also ground observation. It constructs them using what it believes are the same German methods, and it carries out live fire exercises against them. And it gauges the extent of the German trenches to resist damage. And the results it actually has in January and February 1915 are positive. It believes with a sufficient weight of fire, it's possible to batter down the German defences, to breach the German barbed wire, and allow the infantry to cross. Sometimes the idea that fire and movement becomes fire then movement is seen as a negative, a retrogressive step. In actual fact, it's not. It's a practical response to the difficulties the British Army is facing. And it doesn't mean that the Royal Artillery will simply cease fire once the bombardment has carried out. It will still hopefully provide a form of fire support. Furthermore, the infantry, as they advance, will still employ fire and movement tactics, covering fire from rifles, machine guns, and other weapons as they become available. It's a reasoned and measured response to the problems that are faced. And of course, in the first battle where these methods are employed, Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, it actually succeeds in breaking open the German line and passing into the German trenches. But of course, as we know, it cannot be exploited. The story of how the Royal Artillery adapts to the conditions of 1915 has been well covered in the literature, though I still think there's a great deal more work to be done in this field. But what I'd like to offer you over the remaining 20 minutes or so I have, is the discussion of infantry in the British Army in 1915. And I think that is quite important because of the idea that fire movement becomes fire then movement is so prevalent. There's a sense that British infantry are simply reactive, that they are unable to conduct tactics, that they lose interest in tactical activities, that they simply march behind where the artillery falls. In actual fact, this was not part of the British pre-war thinking, and it was not the way the British infantry fought in 1915. And if we're interested in adaptation, which of course is the theme of the conference, I think looking at the British infantry in 1915 carries a number of interesting and relevant ideas and lessons. So, with the new assault methods codified by created by early 1915, the infantry still had a role to play. And infantry development from late 14 to 15 is rather interesting. We've heard this morning that the British Army before the Boer War was actually probably on the cusp of something of a tactical revolution. This was carried out after the Boer War. And these ideas of fire and movement, the high standards of marksmanship, the high standards of fieldcraft that were the trademark of the pre-war army remained even after those bruising battles in 1914 had inflicted severe damage on the old BEF. There's a perception that the old BEF was completely destroyed by the end of the First Battle of Ypres 1914. There is some truth in this, absolutely there is truth in this, but one is apt to forget that there was still a substantial body of pre-war trained infantry available to the British Army in the form of the Indian Army, in the form of regular battalions that were stationed around the Empire, and also in the form of the Territorial Army, which although looked down upon by the British regulars, was nevertheless a pre-war trained force of infantry that could, theoretically at least, be brought up to regular standards far faster than the wartime volunteers that were now appearing in large numbers within the army. And so the infantry in 14 and 15 was not completely de-skilled at this stage. This would come later, as I will explain to you. There was still a strong embodiment of the old regular ethos of adaptability, of flexibility. And there was still a strong element of combat experience that shot through, particularly the officer class of the pre-war, from the pre-war army, experiencing small wars and colonial actions, and which could be drawn upon in the early battles of 1915. And what we see quite early on in 1915 is a spirit of adaptation. Almost immediately as the trench lines begin to settle in October 1914 at the River Ain, infantry officers begin calling for weaponry which will be useful to them in trench warfare. Brigadier General Charles Fitzclarence, VC, won the VC in the Boer War. He commands the first trench raid that is carried out on German lines on the night of the 4th and the 5th of October 1914. Within a few days after this raid has taken place, he submits a request to the Quartermaster General's Department asking for rifle grenades, steel shields to protect snipers and marksmen, hand grenades, and mining devices for which can be used to either clear German barbed wire or even dig under their trenches. Sir John French received so many requests from his infantry officers for mortars that he actually forwards to the War Office an article describing a German mortar, a Minenwerfer, sends it to the War Office and simply says, copy this. We need one of these. The War Office doesn't, partially because it would violate the patent that had been taken out on this device. Never let it be said the British aren't gentlemen. But there is adaptation immediately. There is a recognition that this is no longer the open warfare of August to September 1914. This is becoming something rather different. It's codified by February 1915 when William Robertson, the Chief of Staff of the Army, issues an interesting memorandum where he describes what the British Army is facing as fortress warfare, which will require methodical methods suitable to a siege. And what Robertson envisages is heavy artillery support, limited objectives, slowly but surely chewing one's way into the German defensive line using whatever methods are available. And the infantry begins to adapt to take this type of approach. We can see adaptation almost from the beginning of the campaign for the British Army. When 7th Division, a newly formed division raised from colonial battalions, arrives on the Western Front, it's caught out by the conditions compared to those they were trained for before the war. 7th Division exposes itself too much on forward slopes. It's trying to find the best field of fire, but it exposes itself to German artillery. And a number of officers go, oh, it hasn't learned the lessons from August and September 14. In February 1915, 28th Division, another division drawn from colonial regular battalions, arrives on the Western Front and is surprised by the ferocity of German trench raiding. And again, officers comment, oh, it needs time to adapt. And that word is used very, very specifically. In the case of both 7th Division and 28th Division, they do adapt very readily. But you can see that compared to the divisions that have been on the Western Front a little longer, they're rather behind the times. And this also reveals part of the problem the British Army has in 1915. It simply doesn't like writing things down. It much prefers to adapt in the field, to learn by fighting, to learn by doing. Now, it does write things down, and it translates things as well. A quite remarkable number of French tactical documents are translated, captured German documents are translated, even Belgian documents are translated and distributed around the army. But as Amy mentioned this morning, simply giving somebody something to read is no guarantee you will read it. And if you're an overworked major or a captain, I'm sure you'll have some sympathy with the idea that you're trying to run your battalion in the trenches. The last thing you want is a big pile of War Office produced literature slap on your desk. But the army adapts by fighting and it adapts by doing. And we can see this in a number of fields. First of all, we can witness a clear reorganisation in the British Army in early 1915. Part of this is driven from below and part of it is driven from above. The British First Army, that's Douglas Haig's army on the Western Front, actually orders its brigades to create bomber sections or grenade sections. And we're drawing 30 men from each battalion, having them trained as specialist grenade troops, and then having them actually as a brigade-level asset, which will be distributed to assault battalions as required. That's the sort of reorganisation from top down, but we also see it from bottom up as well. Certain battalions adapt differently to their circumstances. The 1st Coldstream Guards somehow managed to acquire a stock of telescopic rifle sights. How they do this is something of a mystery because they're like gold dust on the Western Front in 1914-15. But the 1st Coldstream Guards acquire 12 of them and actually create a specialist, what they call a marksman's section, later be known as, of course, a sniper group of snipers. They create their own specialist sniper section using the materials they have available. The 1st Gloucesters, who become frustrated that they can hear German working parties operating at night across the trenches and can't interfere with their work, create a night firing section that's based on the use of flares and sudden fusillades designed to suddenly catch the Germans as they are trying to rebuild barbed wire, repair the parapet. And the 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers become famous for a trench raiding group that is created almost by accident. What simply happens is trench raids at this stage of the war are always carried out by volunteers. The 2nd Royal Welsh, a proud fighting battalion of the regular army, considers it its duty to carry out trench raids. And what's observed is the same men volunteer again and again to go on trench raids. Now, some will become casualties, but enough of them survive that they start to become a specialist outfit within their battalion. Other battalions demonstrate the same creation of specialists within their own units. The 1st Gloucesters, for example, have a trench raiding section of about 40 men that become known as the Pirates because they're a sort of brigandy type of ne'er-do-wells in some ways. But they create their own specialist units based on the situation they find. And that creation of specialists is is very much local. Some battalions create no specialists and in fact rather seem to discourage the idea. Indeed, when a new CO of the Gloucesters arrives in the summer of 1915, he's appalled that there's this rather roguish group of trench raiders who, above all else, are excused routine duties. Their duty is to sort of stand around and plan trench raids and think about attacking the Germans at night. Well, that's not on. You're going to take your fair share of duties. And he actually breaks up his own specialist raiding unit with the long-term consequences we can discuss. Other units do not go for specialists. The 1st Somerset Light Infantry, for example, is more interested in simply maintaining rifle standards and trusting to the fact that every infantryman should be capable of doing his job. And that faith, actually, in individual infantrymen is very striking, particularly in early 1915. The plan for the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle relies on making sure every infantryman and NCO has a full idea of what he is meant to achieve as part of the wider plan. And there's still a strong element that harks back to the old army of individual initiative and individual independence. And so specialists, when they do appear, very much spring up indigenously. It's not necessarily pre-planned. Something that drives the creation of specialists is trench raiding, and this is an aspect of the British war on the Western Front that I think is in need of greater study. British Army is only engaged in major battle for about 30 days on the Western Front on 1915. But for the rest of the time, many battalions are engaged either in defending themselves against German raids or carrying out German raids. Raiding acquires a pretty evil reputation later in the war. Many battalions don't like it. Many officers don't like doing it. But in early 15, there's a bit more of a freewheeling spirit, and many battalions actually see themselves as, take pride in the fact they're raiders, take pride in the fact they can get into German trenches, cause mayhem, and escape. And we can pick out any number of units that will ultimately become crack raiding units in 15. The 1st Coldstream Guards, the 1st Gloucesters, the 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, a number of Indian Army regiments, and indeed more besides. And we should not underestimate the importance of these small actions, usually in section strength, but growing in strength as the year progresses. And certainly by August 1915, we have the Canadian raid of Petit Douar Farm, which is actually a battle in miniature and filled with many modern hallmarks that are rather reminiscent of special forces, including blacked out faces, complete surprise, flashlights fitted on the end of rifles, but only to be turned on at the very last possible second to blind the defenders, a subdivision of the raiders into grenadiers, bayonet men, riflemen, and also what rather grisly called cutting men. That's cutting wire, I should add, but it does rather create an image. And this specialisation and development of raiding really becomes quite apparent in a number of British battalions. And we can even see this in the 1st Somerset Light Infantry I mentioned earlier, who were rather reluctant to specialise in early 1915. But in late 1915, one of their sister battalions, the 8th Somersets, actually receive an influx of old veterans. About 250 veteran soldiers are transferred to this new army battalion, and these are experienced trench raiders themselves, and they actually persuade the battalion to undertake a very violent and successful raid against a German position known as the Birdcage opposite them, which is carried out with such success it actually becomes a huge talking point for the Somersets, indeed for the rest of the First World War. So raiding, specialisation, reorganisation, adaptation, and above all else, improvisation. The British Army is not equipped in any way, shape or form to wage a trench war in 1915. It lacks mortars, it lacks sufficient supplies of grenades, it lacks adequate designs of grenades, it lacks sandbags, it lacks sniper rifles. We could go on. We could indeed spend the next 40 minutes talking about what the British Army lacks, but it's more interesting to talk about how the British Army fills that gap. As early as November 1914, the Indian Army has created what it calls a bomb gun. To us, it's a drain pipe that fires a jam-tin bomb in the form of a mortar. It's a crude device, but it's a functional device, and indeed it's adopted very, very quickly by the British Army, who introduced it across their fighting forces. We also see this in the introduction of homemade grenades, the jam-tin bomb the most famous, but there were many other types of grenades pioneered by homemade manufacture just behind the front line and distributed to the troops. And indeed, we might laugh at the crudeness of these weapons, but without them, the British Army would simply have lacked any form of fighting equipment necessary for the battles it was facing. What I hope to get across with this is that the infantry were absolutely not static. They were adaptable, they were flexible, they were moving towards speciality, they were understanding many of the local, small-scale tactical problems the Western Front provided. But as we know, of course, I gave away at the start of this lecture, the British Army does not win many battles on the Western Front. Arguably, it wins no major battles on the Western Front in 1915. Why is this the case? Well, the army, despite its improvisation, is still desperately ill-equipped. Asking your army to go into battle against the best equipped, arguably the best trained, and certainly the best organised European in the world, carrying tin bombs, firing mortar rounds from a drain pipe, and using all sorts of other crude and haphazard weapons and devices is simply asking for trouble. And if we magnify this lack of equipment to include the artillery, which is short of modern guns and is short of modern ammunition and is short of effective ammunition, then you have a recipe for very, very serious problems. And I think sometimes in the celebration of British ingenuity on the Western Front, we're apt to forget just how disadvantaged the army was in terms of equipment. The artillery itself, although I've talked about the infantry, the artillery understood the problems of the Western Front, the need to breach the German wire, the need to suppress German fire and so on, but it still was grappling with the best methods to do this. Shooting with the aid of aerial observation was in its infancy, shooting from the map was a rarefied science, flash spotting and sound ranging were still quite crude and unreliable methods, and how to actually maintain fire during the battle was still a subject for debate. The British Army understood curtain fire, as Ian told us this morning, which we now call a form of creeping barrage. But in 1915, it wasn't sure how best to apply this to an assault. It didn't always succeed in applying it to an assault. It didn't understand whether it was better to have a hurricane bombardment to surprise the Germans or a slow, methodical bombardment to destroy the defences entirely. And all of this contributed and was amplified by the lack of artillery equipment. Operational planning as well, if we move beyond the tactical and into the higher reaches of the army, operational planning left much to be desired in 1915. Even Gary Sheffield, in his famous revisionist study, Forgotten Victory, commented that if any year fulfills the stereotype portrayed by Oh, What a Lovely War, it's 1915. And something that comes across very strongly, particularly in the early battles fought by First Army down at Auvers Ridge, is the fact that the planners do not seem to recognise the limitations of the army they are commanding. They ask their army to carry out far too much with far too little. There's a clear mismatch between operational ambition and what is tactically possible within the British Army. And I think in some ways this is an actual overspill of some of the difficulties the British Army has had during its development before the First World War. I always get the impression when reading both about the Boer War and 1914, the British Army simply relies on the fact its soldiers are tough, well-trained, generally courageous, know what they're doing. It relies on its soldiers to fight its way out of trouble. It doesn't matter if the plan isn't perfect. It doesn't matter if there's problems at the operational level. Your battalions will fight you out of trouble. In some ways, that had been the experience of 1914. But in 1915, much more effort was required to marry the operational plan with the tactical reality, and frequently this did not happen. And what this led to was a terrible and irreplaceable cost in the British Army. We've talked about the adaptation in British infantry battalions. We've talked about the existence of a stock of pre-war trained infantry that was useful to the army and was indeed incorporated into their planning. But every battle the British Army fought cost it these trained soldiers. There was no policy, there was no concept within the British Army of how to expand properly in wartime. And although various ideas have been put forward about using regular soldiers to provide experienced cadres for incoming volunteers and so forth, these were never put into practice. Instead, the army simply fed in its most experienced troops again and again and again, gradually destroying them, turning them into a wasting asset that could not be replaced. And because the British Army was somewhat averse to writing down its lessons, there was no formal process of lessons learned from the early battles of 1915. Individual divisions produced reports, individual battalions produced reports, but actually coalescing that into something that would be useful, that could be fed into the training of the new armies, was still difficult, and it relied a great deal on the individual enlightenment of new army divisional commanders. And so what we see in 1915 is the army adapting and becoming flexible and really quite quickly getting to grips with the tactical problems of the Western Front, but at the same time it's being destroyed. It's losing its experience even as it gains it. And the four big battles that are fought up to May 1915 cost the British Army 100,000 casualties, a trifling figure compared to the losses of the French, but very severe because it falls almost entirely upon pre-war trained infantry, regulars, territorials and Indian Army soldiers. These men cannot be replaced. These are the men who are driving your adaptation, and they're being killed and wounded in large numbers and replaced by soldiers who have no experience. And so in a way, much of this adaptation that goes on in 1915 is being lost and has to be relearned in 1916. And I think this poses some profound questions about how small professional armies expand and replace casualties during intense conflicts. And I think some of those questions are still relevant today. I'd like to end with two contrasts, which I think illustrate in some ways what the British Army could do and what it too often did do. I mentioned there were very few victories on the Western Front in 1915, arguably no major victories. But there was one notable victory, and this was masterminded by this gentleman who I mentioned earlier, a man who felt he was uninitiated in trench warfare in December 1914, Walter Congreve, VC. He'd won his VC at the Battle of Colenso in the Boer War. A rifleman by trade, he was commanding 6th Division on 2nd Army's front around Ypres in August 1915, and he was tasked with the retaking of Hooge Chateau, an important elevated position that had already resisted 2 British attempts to capture it earlier in the summer. Congreve's methods that he employed to capture Hooge Chateau are worthy of study, and indeed it was recognised they were worthy of study in 1915. He was able to amass a substantial amount of artillery, including some British heavy artillery, and crucially 2 French batteries of 75mm guns and some French mortar support, which was provided to him. His plan for the assault was to carry out the same duration of bombardment, a 2-hour bombardment, every night from 1 a.m. to about 3 a.m. for 4 nights in a row. This, we believed, would numb the Germans. It would make them used to being bombarded at night. It would allow them to fall into what he called a dangerous sense of relaxation. How you can be relaxed under a nighttime bombardment, I'm not sure, but I'm sure you see the point. On the 5th night, Congreve launched his attack. His infantry crawled to within very, very close range of the German trenches, with British shells still bursting on top of them, and there were a number of friendly fire casualties from shells that dropped short. The bombardment lifted at 3:15 a.m. and went on to the next line of German trenches, and his infantry poured into the German trenches, overwhelmed the defenders who hadn't yet exited their dugouts, and indeed captured the entire position at a remarkably low cost. Congreve then halted the advance. He ordered his troops to consolidate in the dark, and he awaited the German counterattack. And inevitably that appeared around dawn, preceded by very heavy German artillery fire. German counterattack troops tried to regain Hooge Chateau, but they were beaten off by the defenders. Congreve reflected later that had the British not consolidated this position, the weight of German artillery fire would undoubtedly have broken them up, and the counterattack would have swept them away. Hooge was a small operation, divisional in size, although with substantial artillery support. But even at the time, it was recognised in Second Army that this was a model of how to carry out a small operation. It's interesting that Hooge is cited as an example, and you can find memoranda and paperwork on Hooge finding its way into a number of publications in late 15 and early 1916. My second and final example involves this man, Richard Haking, who may well be familiar to some of the Australians in the audience. Haking was a corps commander at the Battle of Loos in September-October 1915, and he masterminded, amongst other things, the attack on the Hohenzollern Redoubt on the 13th of October 1915. The Hohenzollern Redoubt was a German man-made defensive structure, an elevated structure, which had resisted effectively 3 British divisions at various times in the Battle of Loos. It had been captured by 9th Division. They'd lost it. They'd lost part of it. 28th Division, a regular division, had then tried to take it back, had lost it. Guards Division had taken part of it, but then been driven out. Haking called upon 46th North Midland Division, a pre-war territorial division, pretty well trained by its standards, experienced on the Western Front. He called upon it to retake this very, very tough German position. And unlike Congreve, who massed artillery, carried out deception plans, and had a very realistic and intelligent approach to assaulting this position, Haking did not. He set extremely distant objectives for 46th North Midland Division, and his one contribution to innovation in this assault was that the attack should take place in the middle of the afternoon. He argued this would prevent the Germans counterattacking because it would be dark as the battle finished, but of course it's prevented any attempt at gaining surprise. Needless to say, the assault was a disaster. The artillery bombardment failed completely, failed to suppress the Germans or cut the wire. 46th North Midland advanced, suffered about 55% casualties amongst officers and 44% casualties amongst men. The official history condemned it as nothing more than a useless waste of trained infantry. And all too often we find trained, experienced infantry wasted in this fashion in 1915. My very final point is to do with what happens afterwards. Walter Congreve would go on to command 13th Corps on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the only British corps to achieve all of its first day objectives. He'd later go on to be involved in the Battle of the Byzantine Ridge on the 14th of July 1916, another innovative and successful attack. Richard Haking would, of course, go on to command at the Battle of Fromelles, and I'm sure that battle needs no further introduction to an Australian audience. Thank you very much.